All right, we are the Kato Chain team. We were approached by the CU Blockchain Alliance to create an ecosystem for delivering and verifying certificates from the university via the blockchain. Essentially, they had identified issues with the modern architecture in that the school has to host, servers and things that maintain the data of who has degrees and what degrees and their information. And if someone wants to access or verify that, they have to go through the school, and it's just a bit of an uncomfortable process. So to make that easier and to give more ownership to students who have the degrees, they want to create a system that they are distributed. So using a distributed network like the blockchain, students can kind of control the distribution and verification of their degrees independently, and just make it easier for everybody. So this is the system we created to accomplish that.
So here's the overall system architecture diagram. So this is basically the flow of data from users all the way to our app, and then the response all the way back to the user. There are basically three main parts to our system architecture. There is a backend web server and a front-end web server that are actually the same web server. And they serve front-end data to the users, and it also coordinates backend interactions with the blockchain, which is the last part of our web app. And the general flow is that students upload data to the blockchain via the front end. It gets processed by the back end. A transaction gets sent to the Ethereum virtual machine, and then the blockchain does its thing where it verifies the transactions and then pushes the final transaction to its own permanent ledger, and then a response is sent back to the user. And basically all our functionality is some sort of variant of this process.
As for the backend of the project, we're using a Linux instance on Google Cloud Platform. We're using Cassandra database to store metadata and other transaction-related data. It's scalable and reliable. We're also using SQLite to store username and password for login functionality. It might be vulnerable to injection attacks unless we validate user inputs. We can also put a firewall which blocks unnecessary traffic and possibly filter the packets.
All of the documentation for the functionality between the web app and the front end is all auto-generated using PyDocs.
I guess this slide is really discussing our approach toward computation and how we handle it in our web application. The real big trade-off decision we had to make was between server-side computation versus the smart contract side computation. And there are obvious benefits to both sides, but the basic idea is that the smart contract is way more complex, whereas server-side is more simple and efficient. So therefore, we basically went with the server-side approach to just optimize our product and to get it out as fast as possible. And the other approach we had to decide on was how are we going to generate a wallet, which is one of the functionalities that our app has. And the gist of it is there are two basic ways to do it. One is a centralized approach where we ping a common database or web server to generate this sort of wallet, or we can exploit the permanent ledger that the blockchain keeps to kind of programmatically generate a wallet on the fly without using a centralized database. Ultimately, we ended up using a centralized database just because, again, of efficiency and speed concerns, and we just wanted to get the product out as quickly as possible. And Thomas will talk about this later in the testing section, but we also had to find a way to optimize our smart contract. But we started our development on Ganache, and we moved on to the global test network called Ropsten, and then later we'll eventually migrate into the actual Ethereum network in general. And these are basically of concern during runtime and runtime speed.
So to test this application, we primarily used PyTest because we were running on a Flask application. We were required to test all of the verify functions and the upload functions in order to make sure that it was working with the blockchain and that anything you pushed to it was uploading correctly. For the file upload, we added a function to check the correctness of the CSV files and to disregard invalid inputs to the network. For our test network, we did originally start on Ganache because it was local. But then we moved on to something more realistic using the Robston test network, using their Ethereum in order to test our smart contracts.
For the front end, we primarily used Bootstrap for pre-built icons and banners and to provide some consistency across our site. And we served that with Flask. And one of our priorities was to make this as modular as possible so that each time a group member needed to add a page to our site, they didn't have to relearn how to do the layout and make it match the rest of the site. So we designed it in a way where they could just input the information they needed, put the forms they needed, and we would have a consistent look and appearance across our site as far as our theme went.
One of the more interesting aspects of using Flask and Bootstrap together was the specific functionalities that helped significantly in the development of the project, specifically being able to pass Python functions directly into an HTML file, or just general layouts in a way that looked like Python, even though it wasn't actually Python in the HTML file. Yeah, there was just a lot of online documentation that we were able to use for developing the front end with this.
So this is a demonstration of our complete and running web application. As you can see, if you try to go to the functionality to directly upload data or upload a file, none of it is available until you log in because this is restricted to school administration only. However, the verification function is public, so anyone is able to verify a hash as intended, such as like potential researchers or employers. So let's start by logging in. So this is a test login that we just made called test user, and it should have all of the functionality of school administrator. This is what an example wallet page would look like for a student, so that if you have multiple hashes or certificates uploaded from different colleges, all of this is collected and displayed under one student IDs page. So you would be able to see all of that. Now that we've logged in, the upload a file and upload data features are both available to us. So now I'm going to demonstrate the upload data functionality. From upload data, this is if you want to add a single individual student and then have that on the blockchain. However, upload a file is going to be the majority use case since a lot of students graduate in batches. And so this upload a file functionality is expecting a formatted CSV. And so each line in the CSV is like various fields from students' information, such as like student ID, major, graduation date. And then once we upload the CSV, it's going to take all of the students line by line, hash all of their data so it's anonymous, and associate that under the student ID. And so now that hash is part of the student's wallet page. And if we go to the verification page and take one of these hashes, we're able to check that, yes, the correct information was indeed updated. And this is the basic work cycle of the application. So users would, the administrators would upload student hashes, and then anyone is able to verify these hashes. And yeah, thank you.
So in regards to future directions we want to actually take the application, there are obviously a couple things we could improve on. The main thing is that the blockchain computation on the test network is pretty slow right now. So an obvious next step is to optimize the sort of Ethereum virtual machine bytecode to make it run faster. And another thing that would be very nice would be to have a generic data structure for our smart contract in general. Because right now, what happens is every time you want to make a change to the sort of record that every user has, we have to manually edit that within the code file, recompile it, and then re-upload it into the blockchain, which is obviously a long process and it's pretty inefficient. So ideally, if we had some sort of generic data structure that could just hold any amount of information, then that would be ideal, and especially for a long-running application like this is trying to be. Another thing is that we would also like sort of true decentralization, because obviously our application, as discussed earlier, has a large amount of data that is still controlled by one institution, one server, one database, and things like that. So obviously, if we could move toward true decentralization, that would be more in the spirit of the blockchain in general. And Orgel brought up some earlier security concerns with SQL, but there are also other security concerns involving the blockchain and our just general sort of web server security in general. We obviously didn't think much about it because security is sort of a last step sort of thing, but ideally we'd like the application to be secure. Furthermore, a web API that could be just accessed by other web developers would be really useful in order to get a sort of ecosystem around this app and make it more accessible for other people.
And as for the back end of the project, the increase of data will require more robust and reliable database, and also a better platform to interact with the database itself. So during the project period, we used to manually query the database by going into Cassandra or SQL shell, and that is extremely inefficient, and it's just too hard to visualize, and it's kind of hard when you have bigger data sets. So in the future, we will need to be more organized, and we'll also need visual interface by possibly utilizing open source softwares. And as for the expansion of the project, we can move on to different kinds of certificates that are issued by smaller institutions or even online institutions.
Some of the major challenges we had include the lack of resources and documentation online about blockchain. As it's a relatively emerging technology, we didn't really have any like really convenient resources to learn from, and so we had to scour the internet and dig up a lot of really deep information about it to get started.